This video is about understanding the difference between transitive and substitution property and using the property of vertical angles. So we have three properties. There are two transitive properties and one substitution property. So the transitive property, if angles or segments are congruent to the same angle or segment, they are congruent. And if angles or segments are congruent to congruent angles or segments, they are congruent. In transitive properties, we are only using congruent statements that we can change something out of. In substitution property, we are replacing a value or a variable with an equivalent or congruent value or variable. So let's look at some examples. In number 1, we have that the measure of angle 1 plus the measure of angle 2 is 90 degrees. And we have that angle 1 is congruent to angle 3. So we can take angle 3 and replace angle 1 since they were congruent. So we can say the measure of angle 3 plus the measure of angle 2 is 90 degrees. And this would use the substitution property. In number 2, FG is congruent to KG. GH is congruent to KJ. So because they are both congruent to KJ, we can conclude that FG is congruent to GH by the transitive property. In number 3, we know that angle 1 is complementary to angle 2. And we know that BD bisects angle ABC. So we want to prove that angle 1 is complementary to angle 3. So we are going to prove this by making a little bit longer of a proof. So we have our statements and our reasons. So we always start a proof with our given statements. So we have angle 1 is comp to angle 2, and we know that BD bisects angle ABC. This is given to us. So if we have a bisector, we know that this angle is bisected, so we now know that angle 2 is congruent to angle 3. So we're going to say angle 2 is congruent to angle 3, and our reason is the angle bisector. So we would say angle bisector divides angle into two congruent angles. Now that we know angle 2 and angle 3 are congruent, we know that we can replace angle 2 with 3. So our third statement then is going to be angle 1 is complementary to angle 3 by the substitution property. A couple of vocab words then. So opposite rays are two collinear rays with the common endpoint, and they extend forever in different directions. We also have vertical angles. Vertical angles are two non-adjacent angles that share a common vertex and whose sides are opposite rays. The important thing to remember about vertical angles is that vertical angles are congruent, so we can use those to solve for a variable. So number 1, we want to solve for x. So these are vertical angles that are going to be congruent to each other. So we would have 6x plus 20 is equal to 4x plus 60. That gets us 2x equals 40. We divide, and x is 20. In number 2, we want to solve for x and find the measure of angle 1. So we know that these vertical angles are congruent. X squared plus 3x is equal to 5x plus 35. Move everything to the x squared side, so x squared minus 2x minus 35 equals 0. We need two numbers that multiply to negative 35 and add to negative 2. So we have x minus 7 and x plus 5 is equal to 0. When we switch our signs, x is 7 and x is negative 5. So we need to then find angle 1. So in order to find angle 1, we're first going to test if x equals 7. So if x equals 7, I'm going to plug that into one of my angles. So I can do 5 times 7 plus 35. I get 70 degrees. 70 and angle 1 are supplementary, so I can subtract from 180 to get that angle 1 is going to be 110 degrees. Then, if I use x equals negative 5, negative 5 times 5 plus 35 is 10 degrees. Again, angle 1 and the 10 are supplementary, so I can subtract from 180. So our angle 1 would equal 170 degrees. In number 3, given angle 1 is congruent to angle 3, we want to prove that angle 1 is congruent to angle 5. So we're going to do a bit longer of a proof with a couple of steps here. So remember, we have our statements and our reasons. We always start with our givens. So we have angle 1 is congruent to angle 3, and that is given. In order to prove that angle 1 is congruent to angle 5, we need to make some connection here. Well, we know that angle 5 and angle 3 are congruent because they are vertical angles. So our next step, we're going to say angle 3 is congruent to angle 5. Vertical angles are congruent. Then, because we have two congruency statements, we can take out 3 and replace it with 5. So we would say angle 1 is congruent to angle 5 by the transitive property. In number 4, we have angle R is complementary to angle 2, and angle Y is complementary to angle 1. So we want to prove that R is congruent to Y. So we are going to, again, make a chart to do our proof. And we are going to start with writing the given statement. So angle R is complementary to angle 2, and angle T is complementary to angle 1. And that is given to us. Now we know that angle 1 and angle 2 are congruent because they are vertical angles. So angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. Vertical angles are congruent. Now, because 1 and 2 are congruent and they are complementary to R and Y, we know that angle R is congruent to angle Y, because if angles are complementary to congruent angles, then the angles are congruent.